Let us now go to Mexico and Miami. Jason Myles and Pascal Robert are co-hosts of This Is Revolution.
Doesn't that
And
sound
we're going
awesome? Mexico and Miami, like just two wonderful vacation spots.
I would go there. Oh, my friends.
Greetings.
Thank you for having us.
Mr. Feldman. How are you?
I want to talk to you about a guest on your show, Corey Robin. Who is Corey Robin? He had a piece in Politico entitled, "Republicans Are Moving Rapidly to Cement Minority Rule. Blame the Constitution." Earlier, I was saying that our founding fathers gave us this great tool to cut off powerful men at the knees. What's the problem with the Constitution?
I think Corey Robin would probably disagree with you. And I think he has some great arguments as to why. Pretty much, first of all, thank you for having us on. And
I love having you on the show. Everybody loves having you here.
Yeah, and shout out to your viewers as well. Corey Robin's position is that basically that the United States Constitution was not set up to be a democratic document. First of all, for those who are sticklers for actual political theory and politics, the United States is not a democracy. It is a constitutional republic. And what is the difference between a constitutional republic and a democracy? In a constitutional republic, when you elect a representative, he is representing what he believes is best for your interests, but the choices are vested in him. If we had a democracy, the individuals that you vote for who represent you would have to follow the exact prescription of what those who vote for them actually want. So we actually do not have a democratic system. We have a constitutional republic. And even in that context, there are many elements and aspects of the Constitution that are fundamentally anti-democratic. For example, the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court is a body of lifetime appointees who, by the divine providence of just happening to be lawyers, get to, by their own majority decisions, overthrow legislation that were decided by either the states or the federal government. If you look at the overall long history of the Supreme Court, barring the absolute exception of the Warren Court in the 50s, the Supreme Court has been a profoundly reactionary, pro-corporate, pro-capitalist, generally right-wing institution that has made incredibly horrific decisions. And it was designed that way because if you look at the original makeup of the United States, because of the Electoral College and because of the way apportionment was designed in our process congressionally and senatorial, the South had a disproportionate role in the governing strategy, makeup, and decision-making authority in the United States government. 10 of the 12 of the first presidents of the United States were slaveholders. That's a fact.
And that's because slaves were counted, is it 4/5?
3/5.
3/5. Slaves were counted as 3/5 of a citizen, which means they didn't get to be citizens, but they got representation.
Right. That's because they were not citizens. They had no voting power. They had no benefits of citizenship, but their physical presence in southern states allowed southern congressional delegations to be augmented or increased in size by their sheer presence in the South. But I want to pivot to Jason because I don't want to filibuster.
Excuse me for 1 second, Jason. One thing. We're seeing that now with prisons.
Right. Well, what's interesting about prisons is that, as you probably know, David, is that federal prisons usually are sent to kind of states in the flyover country, and the physical numbers of prisoners in those states are used in representational allotment in those various congressional districts.
That's why you're seeing an interesting movement to allow prisoners the right to vote. You saw it pass in Florida, but it didn't get upheld by the state legislature, right, Pascal?
I believe that's the case. They allowed them to vote after being freed, but some people are considering giving them the right wild howls as well.
Yeah.
Right. Now, Corey Robin is a professor.
He's a political scientist professor at Brooklyn College.
And he's written a book about Clarence Thomas, who
That is correct.
Is now in the hospital taking fluids.
Is he taking fluids now?
I think he was.
He's very ill.
All I keep saying is he has a flu. Does anyone know what he really has or what it is?
He's married to Ginny. That's what he's got.
It could be COVID. They could be trying to keep a bit of a
that's true.
lid on it, because as of right now, the Biden administration is trying to push through a new Supreme Court justice nominee that we've talked about on the show actually quite extensively, who, if you want to make a quick pivot to the Supreme Court, but I will add another thing that is very anti-democratic is the Electoral College. I am from California. That is still where my mailing address is, but a vote in the state of Wyoming, which has vastly less people than California, is worth more than a vote in California.
Let me ask you a question in defense of the Electoral College. My audience gets so mad at me when I say this.
Mm-hmm.
Gets so pissed off at me.
Mm-hmm.
There are rules that were laid down that, yes, were written by slaveholders. I mean, Madison wrote the Constitution. He was a slaveholder. There's no question that they put in these checks to prevent majoritarian rule.
Neither did non-property owning white men couldn't vote. So we have to
until the 1850s, David.
We have to add that caveat in there as well. I think it always let's try to not break things down to a simply racialized lens, because that's also another thing that gets people very emotional. So let's look at it from the lens of like capital, making these decisions, right? Capital controlling individuals. So we control capital. We want to have ruling say so. And this is the law of the land, which is going to be slightly better than it was for us when there was a monarchy that you had to be born into.
Right. But the Democrats, I say, lose not because of the structural disadvantages. I maintain they lose because they're not really Democrats, that they offer nothing. They don't offer enough of a difference to get people to want to vote in what have become traditionally Republican states.
Yeah, but the thing is, though, one thing that I think you have to put in proper context there, David, is that the Democratic Party was the party of the reactionary faction of America pretty much only for outside of maybe 40 years of its history, which is from the rise of the New Deal up until the 70s, maybe 30 some odd years. Before that, the Democratic Party was the party of quote unquote white supremacy or the reactionary South. So I would make the argument that the notion that part of the problem here, and Jason and I have talked about this before, is that we have a misunderstanding of American political history. The reason we have a misunderstanding of American political history is that Americans believe that the normative function of American capitalism is what America looked like in the 50s after World War II.
Right.
What Americans don't realize is that New Deal Keynesianism was the exception, not the norm.
Well, let me throw this on top of what Pascal is saying, maybe to make it even easier to digest using the lens of pop culture, something we just talked about and I've been rereading again. If you look at a movie like Back to the Future, there is an idealized vision that Pascal is talking about of going back to the 50s, which starts with Reagan in 81 with his campaign, he's going to make America great again. And ultimately what he's talking about is this time where even his family came up through the New Deal. But he wants to dismantle the New Deal and then what later became the Great Society programs. And when you look at a movie like Back to the Future, when Michael J. Fox's character goes back to the past, it starts off his neighborhood is actually a pretty dilapidated, old-looking neighborhood with old buildings. There's like a pawn shop in the middle of the town square, and the clock tower still hasn't been fixed for 30 years. And when he goes back to the 50s, He starts to realize that it's a time of racial oppression, which he has no idea about. Sexual repression. You know, his mother talked about how good of a person she was, but she's like a boy crazy young woman, which is something we probably wouldn't, you know, care about nowadays, but it was something that she definitely had to repress because of the times. And even when he parks his car, if you remember, when the car goes to the past, the neighborhood he's supposed to go to, Hill Valley, the houses of the future, it's not. And when we have this idealized vision of this time period, we don't really understand it fully. Like, who really got all those benefits? You know, we talk about it all the time about, you know, who was even able to get Social Security benefits during this time. And it's not every American.
Right.
Well, the thing is, I mean, Jason very eloquently stated some pretty blunt realities as well. But to me, what's more interesting about the fact that the reactionaries, and what does it really mean to be a reactionary? The actual true official definition of a reactionary is someone who looks to the time in the past as what should be the proper normative function of a society today. So someone who's a reactionary is basically saying things were better back then, and everything that's happened nowadays messed everything up. What is really amazing about the reactionary right today, and many of its spokesmen, whether they be Jordan Peterson's or whether they be even Trump's, or even going to Reagan, is that what they call when America was great was the period of time that we had the highest marginal tax rate in American history. We had the greatest government control over private sector enterprise. We had the largest state welfare state in American history, and we had completely state planning. Literally, the New Deal economy of America was equivalent to like Chinese state planning.
Right.
And it's what Reagan, I actually just couldn't.
Destroyed. The rest of the world was destroyed by World War II.
And the rest of the world under the Marshall Plan, which we were financing the development of Europe after World War II. But because of the Bretton Woods Agreement that comes out of 1944, America pretty much is the sole economic monopoly, you know, production power in the world. So we're able to finance and buttress all of this development and, you know, the ability of people to literally have a factory job and live an upper middle class life, if you're a white male, comes out of state planning. It's literally the period of time where the American government functioned closer to socialism than any other time in American history. But those are the good old days.
But that's what Reagan pushes back against when he starts to truly make bigger runs for office in the 60s, after being a spokesperson for GE and an actor and part of the McCarthy campaign to get all the leftists and communists out of Hollywood. Reagan is a very interesting figure because he's also kind of the rise of a personality. Like, as much as we talk about Trump being the first person to literally walk off of the set and into office, which seems kind of fascinating when you think about it. And it's still embarrassing for us as a nation. And I think that's why we have such emotional reactions to Donald Trump. Because if you look at the way he governed, ultimately he governed like a standard Republican, right? But the fact that he walked off set, at least Reagan gave us some years effing up California as the governor, and did have some experience, whether you respect it or not. He did have experience in office and didn't just walk off set. But one thing he did have, despite the fact his movies weren't always big sellers, was he had that job for GE, kind of being in your home every day, even if it's just advertising products. And right. Him and his family became something that the American people could accept. And in my opinion, that is the rise of the personality. And we start looking more at personalities, definitely less policy, because a personality can talk to you differently. They don't really have to talk policy so much. They talk in ideas. So what Pascal is talking about, I find very, very fascinating, because he's saying that this time frame that they go back to constantly is a time when where we have more government control, but all they talk about is big government is the problem.
Right.
That's the main focus of everything he says from the 60s to when he leaves office. Is even the Clinton administration comes in and says big government is the problem.
I have a friend of mine. He's I wouldn't call him left, but he's a friend of mine. He's kind of he's a little radical. He's a bit militant in the traditional kind of racially militant kind of sense, but he has a very interesting position on all this. He said the Republicans, Reagan and those guys, only cared about cutting the state when Black people started to benefit from it.
Right.
So that's the only time. He said all this. Well, if you really think about our theme, the theme we have on our show, one of the themes is the 50+ year counter-revolution. And the premise of the theme is that pretty much all of American politics after 1968 is a counter-revolutionary counter-reaction to the New Deal civil rights coalition of the 60s, which David, you forgot more about than both of us because you were pretty much a young adult probably in that time compared to both of us. But whether we want to, I mean, of course, capitalism is the ultimate culprit here, right? But there is a way in which capitalism utilizes race to facilitate privatization that starts with the rise of Nixon and perpetuates up until Clinton going into Obama. And that discourse is like, these Black folk out here are eating up your taxes with these programs.
Even though white people per capita are more likely to be welfare recipients, people of color.
That's correct.
But we never talk about the flyover parts of the country. We always talk about major metropolitan areas, and we don't even talk about the way in which most Black people arrive in major metropolitan areas. So you have like a small handful of cities where Black people live. I spent too much time driving around and playing shows all over the North American continent. And we used to play a game when we would leave California called Count Your Race. And I lost every time.
Let's go back to Clarence Thomas, because we have a new justice. Their hearings started today for a new African-American, female African-American. Mm-hmm. Clarence Thomas was the second African-American to serve on the court. I believe he replaced Thurgood Marshall. That was a Black seat that they conveniently gave to a conservative who never saw a civil rights bill that he was in favor of. Is there anything, I have read some positive reviews of Clarence Thomas's decisions, that he comes by his decision-making honestly, that they always talk about how quiet he is, that he's not that bright, but he really is bright, and he comes by his conservative bona fides honestly. He came out of Yale Law School. I believe he says he was the recipient of affirmative action and felt demeaned, looked down upon, and looks back at it as a very negative experience for him.
I'd like to jump in here if you would indulge me. Please.
Of course. You're a lawyer, so you know more about this.
I wrote a little bit more than that. When I started writing online, I started with my own blog, and the blog was called Thought Merchant. It's still up. It's on a WordPress blog. One of the first pieces that I wrote, and I should actually find this piece, was a piece I wrote called What Ails Clarence Thomas? The piece was basically an analysis of what motivates Clarence Thomas. And the piece was based on some of the readings I'd done on his biography, and me having gone to law school in Boston and known people who were contemporaries of Clarence Thomas when he was in law school at Yale, because the New England Black collegiate scene was so small then that Black students who went to the elite universities in New England used to come to party in Boston all the time. There are certain basic things that you need to know about Clarence Thomas. Clarence Thomas's whole worldview is shaped as a product of being rejected his whole life. His mother rejected him and left him with his grandfather to raise as a child. Okay. When he was rejected very early on by people and society because he grew up in a poor part. He's a Southern Geechee. Geechee culture is a part of Southern African American culture.
Georgia,
yes. The Gullah Geechee culture has a very kind of organic connection to African history. It's a very independent kind of Southern country culture. I find it actually quite impressive and incredible. But in traditional upper middle class Black American life, to be called a Geechee is a profound pejorative. It's a profound pejorative. Clarence Thomas, very smart guy, goes to a Holy Cross undergrad, starts dealing with Blacks in Boston. Clarence Thomas's resentment towards affirmative action and civil rights is a direct consequence of upper middle class, fifth and sixth generation Black elites, Black Afro-Saxon Brahmins in New England treating him worse than some white liberals did when he was in college, in the South. That his whole attitude towards affirmative action, towards civil rights, he was rejected from getting corporate firm jobs.
Was he ever to the left?
He actually was a revolutionary Black nationalist at one time. He was a huge fan of Malcolm X. See, this is the thing. There are aspects of Black political thought that in the minds of most of white Americans, because they don't peer deeply into it, they actually believe are radical. Like, for example, when you tell someone like, I'm a Black nationalist, like, oh, that guy's a radical guy. If you read the actual ideological origins of Black nationalism as a concept, it's conservative as hell. There's a really good book. I talk about this book all the time. It's called The Golden Age of Black Nationalism. It's written by a man named Wilson Jeremiah Moses. It's probably one of the most seminal, important books to understand the ideological origins of Black nationalism.
And what does Black nationalism mean?
Black nationalism is a political ideology that develops in the 1850s that posits the notion that Black people are a collective nation unto themselves with their own, not only culture, but their own political destiny, their own ideological tendencies that should be focused on collectively working as a unitary body. There is a component of it to the point where some believe that they should have their own separate land. Black nationalists tend to be not in favor of integration. They believe in separate Black autonomy and Black development of institutions controlled, dominated by Black people, and not dependent on any aspect of quote unquote white society.
And he was a Black nationalist. So what changed him? Yale Law School?
I don't see, this is what Corey Robin posits. Corey Robin, remember I told you that Black nationalism is actually a right wing, it's not right wing, it's a reactionary ideology in many ways. Corey Robin's position is that Clarence Thomas not only was a Black nationalist, but he still is a Black nationalist in many ways. Because there are many aspects of Black nationalism that are very pro-capitalist, particularly Black capitalism.
Pro-segregation.
Yeah, pick yourself up by your bootstraps. Don't depend on the government. Don't depend on the white man. Get off that government assistance. Do on your own. You don't need that affirmative action. You know, pick up your pants. You know, why your pants sagging? Clean up your clothes. Get your stuff together, Black man. Why are you depending on the white man? A lot of white conservatives love that element of Black nationalism.
So a lot of people on this show were surprised by South Carolina, Clyburn, Biden, and the 2020 primary. We assumed Bernie was going to get the black vote in South Carolina in 2020.
I mean, there's been pushback from the quote unquote black vote since the 2016 election, where was it 2015 when the Black Lives Matter founders ran up on him and asked him what his black agenda was when he had a rally. And that was kind of been the knock on the Sanders campaign from jump. I mean, even painting the whole Bernie bro character as an overprivileged white dude that doesn't really give a damn.
That's unfair.
Color. I'm agreeing with you. I'm just saying that this is.
I mean, Bernie was arrested in Chicago fighting for fair housing for African Americans. Biden won't stop lying about being arrested.
Well, Bernie Sanders was targeted by elements of the American media establishment who utilized black voices and weaponized certain foundation hatched elements within black social and political constellations to be perceived as soft on racism and soft on racial issues, because the worst and the scariest thing to the American ruling class is to have black people in large numbers embrace a socialist agenda with white people.
You know what's really frightening when you think about the fact, Pascal and I do a lot of work about even going back into the history of the civil rights movements, beyond just 63. And when you think about the names in this movement, like A. Philip Randolph and Bayard Rustin, these are socialists that understand you need a multiracial, working class-based coalition if you really want to get these programs passed, these initiatives passed. And when the movement changes to inclusion, that is where the American conscience as a whole, I'm not talking about the fringes of people that watch shows like this. I mean, the American conscience as a whole sees the civil rights movement and sees these hero characters like King and to some extent even X. It's all about inclusion. And not even so much economic inclusion. And, one part that gets omitted constantly when we think about the March on Washington speech is the fact that Martin Luther King is saying, before he gets to that last stanza that we all remember, is let this not be a moment of a collective release of frustration and we go back to business as usual.
Right.
And you're going to keep at this until these economic demands are met. That is the march for jobs and freedom, not the march to sit at the lunch counter.
Right.
And because that is our ideal of that moment, it really does mess us up when we think about, certain figures in the past.
It messes us up in so many ways. I mean, one of the biggest problems with my generation, I was born in 1968, on what you would call Generation X, is that we are raised with an overindulgence in civil rights nostalgia. Eyes on the prize, all of this stuff, every Black History Month, all of this stuff. And Jason and I have been working over a year and a half together, and he knows this. I'm not a big fan of the 60s. I'm not. I'm a big fan of the left from the 30s and 40s. The 30s and 40s, when you had the black communists and the white communists and the white communists and the black socialists and the white socialists scare the ruling class so much that they force FDR to implement the New Deal.
The 60s, the left was commodified.
Exactly.
Individualism ruled.
And by the way, it wasn't no college student left in the 30s and 40s. They were working class people who were challenging capital and empire.
But let me get back. We have 5 minutes left to Black conservatism. There is this. We always find Black conservatives to be oddities. People like McWhorter, Clarence Thomas. Is it Sowell? S-O-W-E-L?
Sowell. Bro, I'll be brief about this. We have a new segment on our show on Saturday, and part of it is very tongue in cheek of me messing with Pascal. And I will say as quickly as possible, I love Pascal like family, and much like family, I do have to poke him and tease him from time to time. That's just the way I am. Anyway, part of the little feature that we have, I played Pascal a clip from a movie that he actually enjoys, a movie called Jungle Fever. And in the scene, Samuel Jackson is a drug addict that's kind of cooning. And I was telling Pascal that the definition of coon has officially changed. A coon was someone that reinforced white stereotypes. And now a coon is literally defined as a black person that wants to be white. And that's now how we look at these black conservative figures as quote unquote coons, because they somehow want to be white.
Well, understand, first of all, there is a long tradition in Black American history and politics of conservatism. The ideological progenitor of the Black political class or the Black leadership model or the Black, quote unquote, race management model, which is the model in which Black people, who are 42 million people, have a class of leaders or a leader who brokers the affairs of everyone like a silent ventriloquist, whereas no one chooses him except the ruling class, who speaks from anyone else. The man who is the progenitor, father, and the originator of that paradigm is Booker T. Washington. Booker T. Washington is a man who was chosen by white capitalism to neutralize the populist movement, period. The populist movement was an era of interracial cooperation to challenge capitalism and Southern urban capitalism and create a third-party alternative to the two-party system to meet the needs of the sharecropping farmers who were Black and white in the South. Booker T. Washington was financed through his Tuskegee machine, and big-time corporatists from Rockefeller to all of them backed him in order to basically help create an environment to acquiesce to a political reality that would shut down the populist movement. In 1895, he gives his Atlanta Compromise speech, which is anti-socialist, anti-communist, anti-union, anti-immigrant, anti-working class, which basically promises that Black people will surrender to capital and not rebel. And the year after, 1896, Plessy versus Ferguson is decided that neutralizes Black people's ability to vote politically and politically participate, as well as poor whites, and shuts down the populist movement. Don't forget, this is a man who was financed by the ruling class. If you don't think that 1895 speech was a telegraph to the ruling class, I got a bridge in Brooklyn to sell you.
Okay. So you're not a fan of the 60s. Give me the argument for what the 50s and the 60s and the Warren Court accomplished. Things are better. The schools aren't. The schools are as segregated now as they were in the
pretty segregated.
Worse.
Well, I mean, there's a very good book.
Was there a bigger Black middle class?
No, it's bigger now. It's bigger now.
It's bigger now.
It is bigger now. It's richer now. Black people, there's less Black people in poverty now. In 1959, 55% of Black people lived below the poverty line. You can imagine what the poverty line was in 1959. In 2020, it is 23% of Black people live below the poverty line, but there were much less Black men in prison during Jim Crow than there are today. That's also a fact. So that's a contributing factor. So yes, there are more Black people who are middle class. There are more Black people who are college educated. There are more Black people who are making over $100,000 a year. Yet, in terms of overall percentage of overall American gross wealth and GDP, Black people still own no more than 1.7% of American wealth, which is no different than they owned at any time during Jim Crow. And the Black home ownership rate today is literally exactly what it was in 1967.
That's because of the financial crisis of 2000.
Largely because of the subprime mortgage crisis.
Largely, more Black wealth was lost during that time than any other time.
Any time since the early 20th century, 19th century. 35% of Black wealth eviscerated with no recourse by Barack Obama.
Right. Wow. Well, I can't tell you how grateful we are, Jason and Pascal, that you find time to come on the show. Please come back next Monday. Everybody, the best way to thank our guests is by downloading the This Is Revolution podcast, please go to thisisrevolution.com. I believe that's the website.
Thisisrevolutionpodcast.com. Yeah.
This is Revolution Podcast.
You find everything.
We have a great episode with Corey Robin, who has written a book about Clarence Thomas and Black nationalism, and he is a professor of political science at Brooklyn College. So it's a great conversation. Thank you, Pascal Robert and Jason Myles. Anything you'd like to plug?
Tomorrow night was 6 p.m. Pacific time, 9 p.m. Eastern. We'll be talking with Corey Robin about conservatives and the reactionary right. Why is that? And the Constitution. There is an intro clip up now playing on YouTube. If you go to our YouTube channel, we have a whole playlist of the 3 to 6 minute intro video essays that I make for these shows on Tuesday. So please check that out.
Fantastic. Thank you so much.